Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin Briggs. I'm Executive Director of Preservation Greensboro, and we're glad that you're watching our 11th in our series of Guilford at 250. Guilford County is celebrating in 2021 its 250th birthday. The county was established in 1771. And in honor of our birthday, we're looking at different themes of our built environment through this Guilford at 250 series. In the past, we've looked at modernist architecture. We looked at the Reconstruction era. We looked at different architectural themes within the county. And today we're really celebrating Guilford women in architecture. Guilford County has an amazing history of women's empowerment and women's involvement. And that extends into architecture, as you will hear shortly. Women have shaped and influenced our city and contributed to our unique and special sense of place in High Point and Greensboro and Jamestown and Whitsett and all around different examples that we'll hear about. Today we have with us architectural historian, public historian Sonia Laney Davis. She is based here in Greensboro. She received her bachelor's in history from NC State and has a master's in history with a concentration in museum studies from UNCG. She is an architectural consultant with Gate City Preservation. She loves telling stories about places and the people involved, and she loves overlooked places and untold histories. In addition to her work with Gate City Preservation, Sonia is an outreach coordinator for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources Marketing and Communications Division, and she also serves on the executive board of the North Carolina Museum Council. I recently was involved with her with a Preservation North Carolina conference presentation on the John Coltrane House in High Point, the Blair Coltrane House. Sonia, thank you so much for taking time with us to explore the theme of Guilford women in architecture. Please tell us more.
Thanks, Benjamin. I am excited to be here. Talking about women's history is one of my favorite things to do, so this is a real treat. I am going to share my screen real quick. All right. And hopefully you can see that PowerPoint. So talking about women's history in Guilford County would be impossible to do in just one session. For the last 250 years, women have changed, created, and protected the built landscape across Guilford County. Through the exploration of these sites and buildings that were built for and by women, we can explore how women, both individually and collectively, have impacted the overall history of Guilford County. Because there's no way to discuss the vastness of women's history in Guilford County in its totality, I'll be focusing on three major themes throughout this presentation to help guide us through our discussion. So first, we'll explore the number and impact of educational spaces built in Guilford County specifically for women. Second, we will look at architectural commissions by women in Guilford County. And finally, we'll look at sites of collective action by women in terms of architecture and preservation. All right, so why are there so many spaces built for and by women in Guilford County that are educational institutions? Guilford County has a plethora of upper and higher education institutions, but so many were built specifically for women. Why was the commitment to women's education so important in the development of both Guilford County and North Carolina as a whole? So the first place we're going to talk about is Greensboro Female College, which is now called Greensboro College. Greensboro Female College was the first college to open in Greensboro in 1833. It's organized by Reverend Peter Daub. The school was affiliated with the Methodist Church and chartered in 1838. It was the first chartered college for women in North Carolina, and it was the third chartered college for women in the United States. The first students entered in 1846 after the completion of a building that stood on the site of where the current main building stands today. When that original building burned in 1863, the college was forced to close for a decade. The college reopened in 1873, but just 30 years later, the Board of Trustees for the school decided to try and close the school and sell its assets. The college president at the time, Lucy H. Robertson, is largely to thank that the college remained open. She was the first woman president of a college in North Carolina, and her and alumna Nannie Lee Smith raised $25,000 to keep the college open. In 1912, the school's name was changed to Greensboro College for Women, and the next year, the first bachelor's degrees were conferred. In 1919, the school's name changed a final time to Greensboro College. By its 100-year anniversary, more than 400 women were enrolled at the college, and in 1954, Greensboro College began admitting men, which was one of the first women's colleges in the nation to do so. We'll see a theme here with the colleges in Greensboro changing names multiple times. They really got on the name-changing craze. So the next school we are going to explore is Bennett College. Bennett College began in 1873 as a co-educational school for African-American youth. Founded for and by newly emancipated enslaved people, the Freedmen's Aid and Southern Education Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church founded the school and supported its mission. The school first began in the basement of the Warnersville Methodist Episcopal Church, which is now known as St. Matthew's United Methodist. Initially, 70 young men and women started their elementary and secondary level studies at the school. Lyman Bennett, a teacher and philanthropist, donated the first $10,000 to purchase land and build a space for classrooms and the first dormitory building. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Women's Home Missionary Society sought to build a school for young Black women in North Carolina. In 1926, the society joined forces with the Board of Education of the church to make Bennett College solely a school for young women. That same year, the new senior college was built up and expanded to include 9 buildings over a tract of land of 38 acres near downtown Greensboro. The school graduated its first college class of 4 women in 1930. Bennett College has had a really robust history for many years since its foundation. Dr. Willoughby Player was named the first female president of the college in 1956. And in doing so, she was also the first African-American woman in the entire country to be named president of a 4-year fully accredited liberal arts school. Dr. Player was really instrumental in the impact that Bennett College had on the civil rights movement in North Carolina. The women of Bennett College, known as the Bennett Bells, were major players during the civil rights movement here in both Guilford County and especially North Carolina. As early as 1938, the Bennett Bells picketed the Carolina and National Theaters in Greensboro when the theaters refused to show films featuring both African-American and white actors. In 1960, the Bennett Bells joined forces with North Carolina A&T students to participate in the sit-ins at the downtown Greensboro Woolworths counter. 40% of Bennett College students participated in civil rights demonstrations in Greensboro between 1960 and 1963. And during that time, local police jailed nearly half of the student body for their activism. The president of Bennett College at the time, Dr. Willa Player, really showed her support for her students' demonstrations and civic work. She refused to order students to come back to campus for classes and instead provided them with their coursework and personal items while they were in jail. Protests continued until students in Greensboro finally achieved their goal, though. The city desegregated lunch counters in 1960, although Greensboro public schools would not desegregate for another 11 years. Dr. Player made it possible for Bennett women to become really serious activists. Her support was essential in those efforts. And while the North Carolina A&T students known as the Greensboro Four are certainly the most well-known of the February 1st, 1960 Woolworths demonstration characters, the women of Bennett College sat right alongside them through their entire protest. So if you see up here on the PowerPoint on the left are some of those picketing and protests that the Bennett Bells took place in. All right, my alma mater. So now called the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, the North Carolina State Normal and Industrial School was chartered in February of 1891. 2 educators, Charles Duncan McKeever and Edwin A. Alderman, had been advocating for many years for a state normal school to train teachers, particularly women. Several cities in the state hoped to house the school, but ultimately the city of Greensboro won the bid by pledging an additional $30,000 to build the school. The initial site of the school was just a 10-acre tract of land, which is now expanded to over 200 acres, surrounded by urban and residential areas. The school became a college in 1897, with its first baccalaureate degrees following in 1903. The college offered degrees in teacher training, as well as the domestic sciences and commercial subjects. Eventually, the curriculum expanded to include liberal and performing arts. In 1919, the college was renamed the North Carolina College for Women and joined the University of North Carolina system in 1931, becoming the Women's College of the University of North Carolina. In 1963, the school became coeducational and expanded its educational mission again, finally becoming the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So this next place, I should say, is my favorite place to talk about. I worked at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Memorial Museum, housed at the Historic Palmer Memorial Institute, which you can still visit. They are open to the public and they are a North Carolina State Historic Site. Palmer Memorial Institute was founded by Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown in Sedalia, which is just on the eastern side of Guilford County. The school opened in 1902 as a community school for the area's Black students. Eventually, Palmer Memorial Institute would grow to become one of the finest college preparatory schools in the entire country. While Palmer was always a coeducational institute, Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown offered opportunities for young Black women that they may not have had otherwise. Students, including female students, could take business classes to foster their entrepreneurial spirit. They were encouraged to participate in campus clubs in order to become better citizens. And young female students were paid for their typically domestic duties that they had to do on campus, such as cleaning and laundry. Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown really wanted to show these women that domestic tasks had value both monetarily and in society, which is pretty groundbreaking for the early 1900s. Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was truly a force to be reckoned with. She stood right about 5 feet tall, so she packed a really big personality into a very small frame. She worked with local educators such as UNCG's Charles McKeever to establish and fund her school. She named her school the Palmer Memorial Institute after her mentor, who was the first female president of Wellesley College, Alice Freeman Palmer. And she was influenced at a very early age during her upbringing in Massachusetts for her unusually open access to education. She went to a grammar school early in life and continued her education well into her adulthood. She strived to provide young women with that access to education like she had, and she was initially hired to teach by the American Missionary Association. Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was a woman that refused to take no for an answer. She approached two of Greensboro's most well-known architects during the heights of their career to design and build several of the buildings on the campus of Palmer Memorial Institute. Harry Barton and Charles Hartman designed 3 cottages, 2 dormitories, and the school's dining hall during the 1920s. One of those cottages was her personal residence, which is pretty grand. It's 3,000 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, built in the 1920s for a single Black woman. It's really a testament to her spirit and her success. Eventually, Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown expanded her school to include nearly 400 acres of land and 15 buildings. Over 1,000 students graduated from the school during the 69 years that it was open. The vast majority of young women who graduated from Palmer went on to college, and many of them pursued postgraduate degrees. In a time when women, especially Black women, were left out of educational and public spaces, Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown carved new opportunities for her students. The school eventually closed in 1971 due to financial difficulties and a disastrous fire that destroyed the main academic building. But the Alumni Association of Palmer Memorial Institute is still very active and still works to expand the mission and tell people about the story of Palmer and Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Like I said, if you haven't been there, it's an incredible place and an incredible story. It's well worth visiting. Not that I'm biased at all. All right, so North Carolina, as we have very briefly discussed, has placed an emphasis on women's education. Through Guilford County, it took another step, however, with creating so many schooling opportunities for young women. The history of women's education in North Carolina is long. North Carolina boasts the oldest educational institution that continues to be for women at Salem College, which opened in 1772. And though many schools for women established in North Carolina over the last 250 years no longer exist, the state was once home to 28 schools devoted specifically to females, while many other co-educational schools prioritized access for women to obtain an education in ways that other schools across the country were not. All right, so we have explored some of the educational spaces built for women in Guilford County, but what about some of the buildings commissioned by women? As with the greater women's history of Guilford County, it's impossible to talk about every woman-driven architectural commission in the county. My hope is that by exploring a few individual buildings and homes, we can see how women changed the built landscape in Guilford County and really fostered a spirit of inclusion and equality across the county. So our first building we'll look at is the Ella Fishblate Whale building, the block on 314 to 316 South Elm Street in Greensboro. She purchased the site of this building in July of 1898 to house the Simpson Shields Shoe Company. That feels like a tongue twister. The large building was completed by Greensboro-based contractor and stonemason Thomas Woodruff in December of 1898. So that's a pretty quick turnaround. That's like 6 months. So she wasn't messing around. Just a few months later, she purchased the adjoining lot at 316 South Elm and began planning an even larger building. This Renaissance Revival building was one of the largest business buildings in Greensboro, standing at 150 feet long, 31 and a half feet wide, and 5 stories tall, complete with a cellar in the rear of the building. In October of 1898, the Greensboro Telegram reported that the building would be a, quote, credit to the city, and had already been leased for a period of 5 years to the merchant's grocery store. 316 Elm was 50 feet longer and 6 feet wider than its neighbor at the Simpson Shields Shoes Company. And according to the Greensboro Telegram, the two businesses were, quote, 2 of the largest and busiest wholesale houses and have come to stay and grow. So who was this woman that commissioned the construction of these 2 behemoth buildings? Ella Fishblate Whale was the daughter of Wilmington, North Carolina Mayor Solomon H. Fishblate. She married Solomon Cohen Whale in 1887. He had graduated from UNC in 1885, moved to New York City in 1896 with his wife, where he was elected to the state legislature. At just 34, however, he died in April of 1898. The newly widowed Ella moved back to Greensboro from New York City to be closer to her family in North Carolina. And it took just 3 months for her to forge her own pathway into real estate and change the footprint of downtown Greensboro. The building still stands today, which was formerly occupied by Miller Furniture. Just down the road, there we go, from downtown Greensboro, the Kilby Hotel stood tall at 627 East Washington Street in High Point. This is a really cool story. Everyone should know about Nannie Kilby. Erected in 1910, the 3-story brick Richardsonian Romanesque building was one of the largest structures in the East Washington Street district until it collapsed in 2014. The Kilby Hotel was once a centerpiece of the High Point African American Business District. Originally owned by Nannie Kilby, the business thrived at a time when African Americans, particularly African American women, were forced out of business. As a Black woman in the Jim Crow South, Nannie Kilby not only defied the odds with her successful business, but she really exceeded them. She was an entrepreneur who capitalized on real estate investments at a time when African American women were systematically disenfranchised. The Kilby Hotel and the adjacent arcade were one of the most prominent Black-owned businesses in High Point. The hotel boasted cathedral ceilings, winding hallways, and expensive china for its guests who traveled from all over the country to stay there. The Kilby Hotel and Arcade was one of High Point's Green Book sites, which offered safe places for African Americans to eat, stay, and travel across the country. And the Arcade boasted excellent entertainment and served as a neighborhood social center for Black High Point residents and travelers during the Jim Crow era. I should say too, the spelling of Nannie's name varies. Sometimes it's N-A-N-N-Y, sometimes it's N-A-N-N-I-E. I used Y here just for the sake of staying consistent. So on the left, you'll see a photo of John and Nannie Kilby, the owners of the Kilby Hotel. John and Nannie Kilby were both born in Alamance County in 1873 and 1877, respectively. After their marriage in 1895, the couple moved to High Point. John worked for the Southern Railroad Company for over 25 years, and along with owning the hotel, Nannie Kilby worked as a nurse, a hairdresser, and even sold fish from a horse-drawn wagon. She had a reputation of being one of the hardest working women in the city in the early 1900s, and the Kilbys became business leaders in High Point rather quickly. The couple invested heavily in real estate, and Nannie Kilby eventually acquired approximately 30 houses in the Washington and Leonard Street area and several buildings and lots. Nannie Kilby died in 1921, and her obituary in the local newspaper described her as, quote, well-to-do and one of the city's best Negroes. The building was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. Unfortunately, the Kilby Hotel had eclipsed into poor shape in recent years. The roof and several of the walls collapsed in 2014, and the remainder of the building was demolished soon after due to safety concerns. All right, so those familiar with Greensboro architecture will not be surprised to hear the name of Harry Barton again. The architect who designed the Effie Anderson House. The Effie Anderson House, standing at 303 South Mendenhall Street in the College Hill neighborhood, was a colonial revival style home. The home was commissioned in 1914 by, surprise, surprise, Effie Anderson, the widow of fruit and produce wholesaler William Irvin Anderson. W.I. Anderson owned a produce store that stood at 245 East Friendly Avenue. And although the building has been altered significantly, it still stands today. And if you take a close look next time you're walking by, right above the door, you can still see fruits and produce seen. So some of those little ways that Greensboro's historical footprint continues to stay despite all the developments that are happening. The Effie Anderson House was one of Harry Barton's earlier commissions, but he would go on to become one of Greensboro's premier architects. He was one of the first licensed architects in North Carolina, and his projects include those such as the Presbyterian Church of the Covenant on South Mendenhall, the Guilford County Courthouse in 1918, the Cone Export and Commission Building in 1924, and War Memorial Stadium, 17 buildings on the campus of UNCG throughout the 1920s, also Palmer Memorial Institute, as we've discussed, and dozens of residential projects. After Effie Anderson's death in 1946, she sold the home to her daughter, Fanny Anderson, and in 2013, the home was nominated for and granted local landmark designation by the Guilford County Preservation Committee. If you've been paying attention, you may have seen my cat, Indy, trying to learn today. Historically, groups of women in Greensboro have worked together to preserve historic structures. We've talked about some of the work that groups of women have done. We've talked about some of the individual commissions by women, but let's take a look at some of the collective action by women's clubs and groups that has resulted in impressive and impactful architectural and preservation projects across the county. All right, so our first stop on this tour is going to be the Weir-Jordan House, which has been lovingly preserved since 1921 by the Greensboro Women's Club. Standing at 223 North Edgeworth Street, just catty corner from the Grasshopper Stadium, the Weir-Jordan House is one of just a handful of surviving antebellum buildings in the city. The home was built in 1846 by Dr. David P. Weir. Weir was a native of Ireland who established a medical practice here in Greensboro in 1840. He was also the treasurer for the Edgeworth Female Seminary, which is a well-known finishing school for women established by Governor John Motley Moorhead, which was open from 1840 until it was destroyed by fire in 1872. So again, we're seeing some of those connections with women's education coming in. Weir also briefly served as the head of the school in 1844. After the death of Dr. Weir, the house fell into the possession of his wife, Susan, who owned it until 1890. At that time, the house was sold to James F. Jordan. Jordan was a prominent Greensboro tobacconist, city commissioner, director of the Chamber of Commerce, and even served as Guilford County sheriff. Jordan and his wife owned the house until 1921, when it was sold to the Greensboro Women's Club. The Greensboro Women's Club, organized with 157 charter members in 1909, uses the house as their club headquarters and also rents it out for events. The Women's Club has worked to promote community betterment and cultural improvement for over 100 years in much of their collective action across the city. They have established the Greensboro chapter of the American Red Cross, the Junior Women's Club of Greensboro, the Guilford County Cancer Society, the Guilford County Fine Arts Association, and many other community improvement initiatives and organizations. The house has been restored, though it maintains its original doors, molding, and leaded glass windows, and it's received upgrades to include a commercial kitchen and modern HVAC. In 1984, the Weir-Jordan House was admitted to the National Register of Historic Places, thanks in large part to the loving care shown to it for over a century by the Greensboro Women's Club. The Junior League of Greensboro followed in the historic footsteps of its mother organization and helped restore another historic property in Greensboro. The club restored the historic Albright House at 3101 West Friendly Avenue in 2008. This wasn't the club's first foray into historic preservation, however. In the 1970s, the club raised money to help support the restoration of the historic Blandwood Mansion, home to Greensboro Preservation. The historic Albright House was likely built for Daniel E. Albright and his wife, Julia Kirkpatrick, upon their marriage in the 1850s. The house was on Preservation Greensboro's watch list for historic homes in danger, but luckily the Junior League came in and helped to save it. The historic Albright House is now the club's headquarters and stands as a testament to their commitment to preserving some of Greensboro's most important places. All right. So we talked briefly about student action with the Bennett Bells and their role in the civil rights movement. But let's talk about the impact of students on Greensboro architecture with the UNCG commencement houses. These are a really cool story that I don't know that a lot of people know about. This story was a unique partnership between the Women's College, which is now UNCG, and the area's architects and builders that resulted in 2 homes that were built by these young women. So 23 women in 1958, majoring in either art and residential design or home economics, were supervised by local architect Edward Lowenstein to build a tri-level structure beginning in 1858. So these weren't architecture students, but they were given the chance to design and watch the building of 2 really modern homes. Each student was responsible for one phase of design and a phase of the construction supervision process. The students had to plan a house that had a sale price of right around $30,000, which is about $250,000 today. The house needed to include a foyer, a formal living room, a family room, a dining room, a kitchen, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a garage. When the 1958 commencement house was finished, the 1958 commencement house is up here on the screen. The Greensboro Daily News proclaimed it as, quote, as modern as tomorrow, and hailed the women who designed it as pioneers. The newspaper also said that they, the women, are the first pupils outside of the schools of architecture to attempt the complete designing and building of a house. The collaboration of the 1958 commencement house was so successful that the project continued the next year with a second house. The supervising architect, Ed Lowenstein, was a well-known architect in Greensboro. The first commencement house, the 1958 commencement house, was demolished. It used to stand in Irving Park, but the 1959 house still stands. This collaboration between some of the most well-known and respected builders and architects in the city and the young female college students is really groundbreaking. Inviting young women who were not studying architecture to work together to create new modern homes shows the commitment that not only Lowenstein, but the Women's College had in breaking down gender barriers facing young Greensboro women. This was not Lowenstein's first foray into pretty dramatic inclusion for the time, though. In fact, he was the first white architect in North Carolina to hire Black architects as early as 1950. So, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, it's impossible to cover all of Guilford County's women's history in just one discussion. My hope is that by exploring a few women, a few buildings, a few instances of collective action, your curiosity has been piqued to explore more on your own. Throughout its 250-year history, Guilford County has been shaped in physical, cultural, and historical ways, thanks to the impact and contribution. I hope that you are inspired by the acts of women in Guilford County and motivated to find out more about the history that surrounds you.
Sonia, thank you so much for that review. Just as you were relaying, I was thinking you've covered a lot, and there's so much more that people can dig into if they're interested in exploring. I'm thinking of the Florence Female Academy near Jamestown that was established in the 1850s for young Quaker women. I'm thinking of the High Point Junior League acquiring a house built in 1907 in High Point about 20 years ago to be their club headquarters. And I'm thinking of just so many different examples of women's involvement in architecture here in Guilford County. Do you discern any patterns or observations about maybe what makes Guilford County a little bit different in North Carolina through your research?
I think that Guilford County has a long and important attitude among its citizens in protecting our history. I mean, when you look at the history of North Carolina as a whole, right, it's really broad. A lot happened in the state. You don't have to go far to find some history. But Guilford County especially, I mean, we've got pre-revolutionary history all the way up to modern civil rights. And I don't think that a lot of places in the country can kind of boast that history. So I think that people who were born and raised and live in Guilford County, it's easy to get swept up in that kind of historical fervor and want to protect the places that we've got. I mean, we have a Revolutionary War battlefield. We've got, the lunch counters from 1960. You just kind of have to turn around to find history around you. And I think that Guilford County folks have capitalized on that, which thank goodness they have.
Right. Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out to the ladies that helped save Blandwood Mansion, where my offices are, and in downtown Greensboro. That was a group of ladies who got together in the 1960s and made it happen. So, well, Sonia, thank you so much for your review. This is fascinating. It just provides more depth of our history of our county, and it's a great way to celebrate 250 years for Guilford. So I hope that watchers will stay tuned. We'll have one more in our series that will air on December 16th. And that'll round out our 250th birthday celebration for Guilford County. So thanks for all that you do for history. And I hope that our viewers will tune in next month and we'll see a little bit more. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.